Welcome to Off the Shelf. I'm your host, Yvonne Wolf. Today, our special guest is Mark Trapp, attorney and author of A Destiny of Undying Greatness, Kiffin Rockwell. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So I understand that Kiffin Rockwell is a very unusual name, but you have a son by that name. Which came first?
Definitely Kiffin Rockwell came first. He was born in 1892 in Tennessee, and I encountered him when I started law school at Washington and Lee University, where he and his brother Paul also attended in the 1900s.
So your paths crossed.
They did. In fact, the first day that I started law school out there in Lexington, Virginia, I was walking around campus trying to acclimate myself and went into Lee Chapel, which is right there in the center of campus, and they had a plaque on the wall, and it said, Kiffin Yates Rockwell, died in Roederan, France, September 23rd, 1916. And it so happened my wife was pregnant with our first child, who turned out to be a daughter. She was born 2 weeks after we started law school, and so we were thinking of baby names.
Yes,
and I just
and
thought,
you were attracted to this unusual name.
Yeah, oh, definitely. It just struck me, and I thought, Kiffin Yates Rockwell, that is the coolest name. There must be a cool person behind this name. Then
But
it occurred.
that was a good 20 years ago, maybe?
Yeah, that was in the fall of 1997.
Yes.
And then I went back home and told my wife, I found the best baby name of all time, Kiffin Yates Rockwell. If we have a baby, we can name him Kiffin. And she said, well, first of all, we might have a her, which we did. We had 4 hers before we had a him. But I just thought
she
Kiffin.
said, no, this is not going to happen.
Yeah, and she said, I don't know about this name.
For a
Kiffin.
girl, right? For a girl, no.
For a girl or even for a boy. I said, well, maybe a middle name.
Yeah.
And it sort of became a running joke over the years that every time we had a girl, everybody would say, well, you didn't have Kiffin yet.
Yeah, yeah.
And that turned out to be true. But what's the original notion of naming someone after him, I wanted to learn a little bit more about him. And it occurred to me right away that what was this guy doing in France in 1916?
Yes.
I didn't know anything about World War I, but I knew enough to know that the United States did not enter until 1917. And so I just thought, what was he doing there?
And then when you finally got a boy, you named him Kiffin.
Yes, and we were surprised. Many years later, we thought we were all done and that we just had 4 girls and that was fine with us.
Yeah.
But in 2014, we had another baby. It turned out to be a boy. He actually was born on the day of the 100-year anniversary that Kiffin Rockwell and his brother Paul enlisted in the Foreign Legion in Paris, France. And I just thought, that's pretty cool.
Yes.
And it rekindled my interest in Kiffin Rockwell, and I started doing some research I thought maybe I would write an article, and it just grew and turned into a book.
Over 500 pages
Yes.
of book. Yes. Well, what an interesting story. I feel like it sounds like coincidental, but it seems almost too funny, right? Because
it's
and we're just past the corner of the 100th anniversary of World War I.
Yes. When I started writing the book, the 100-year anniversary of World War I's beginning had just hit, and I finished the book 5 years later. We actually published it on my son's 5th birthday. But during the whole time that I was researching and writing, there were different events going on that I could keep up with that I learned more and more about World War I. And now I'm still by no means an expert on World War I, but I definitely know a lot about America's entry into the war and what these boys did to influence that.
And this is the story that sounds very incredible as we had just starting to talk about this. But he's not some poor boy who decided to risk his life because there's not much wagered on it, right? I mean,
sure.
He is a...
He was certainly middle class, at least here in America, and a lot of the other boys that come up in the book were very wealthy and from some of the most wealthy and privileged families in America.
At that time, right?
At that time, definitely. One of the boys was Norman Prince, whose father was the chairman of the Union Stockyards Company here in Chicago. He was the descendant of the mayor of Boston and had seats on the Boston and New York Stock Exchange, and was one of the most wealthy families in the world, the Prince family. And they had estates in France and all over the place. And Norman Prince was an idealist who thought, we owe something to France for what Lafayette did for us. And he went over there shortly after Kiffin did.
Yes, many Americans may not, well, the younger students of our American history may not even know about Lafayette, but he was as important to us, our American history, as one of the founding fathers?
Sure. Definitely at that time, he was viewed as on a par with the founding fathers, and still today, I mean, there's a lot of things that you see that are named for Lafayette, cities and counties, and
we know that the Statue of Liberty was directly related to his interests in America. And
sure, it was a gift from France. Actually, the Statue of Liberty comes up in my book a couple times because Kiffin and Paul, when they left for France on August 7th, 1914, they left from New York City, and one of the last things that they saw as they went out was the Statue of Liberty. And I write how at that time the Statue of Liberty was just completing its oxidization process. Oh, it was originally brown, bronze,
not green,
and had just sort of turned a light green right around that time. And I write of how this is somewhat extrapolated from the sources that I had, but I write of how Kiffin and Paul must have looked up at the Statue of Liberty and seen they know it's a gift from France. They see the tablet that she's holding, which has etched on it July 4th, 1776, and thought of the debt that was owed to France, and that's probably the last thing they thought of when they left the shores of America.
They seem so idealistic.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and very... So now, in the early 20th century, the Americans who were from the upper classes in America were thinking about Great Gatsby. They are people who have actually studied in Europe or sent their children abroad. Were these people, the Kiffin and his peers, was it the first time they're going to France? Were they been to France and studied? Or
it varies, Yvonne. Kiffin had never been to France. They had ancestry that went way back centuries that originated in France, and they knew that, and they were very aware of their lineage, and that was one of the reasons he and Paul volunteered to fight for France. But the main reason was that they felt that they owed a debt to Lafayette, that this was a conflict that might eventually involve everyone, and they wanted to be there to take a stand for liberty right at the beginning. But a lot of the other boys, as you mentioned, a lot of the wealthy families in America would send their children abroad, and a lot of the boys who remembered Lafayette, as I call them, were already in Paris, and they were studying at the different schools there, architecture and art and things like that. Or there's boys like Alan Seeger, who had graduated from Harvard and was there hobnobbing with the intellectuals and trying to publish poems that he wrote. He later became one of the most famous poets, American poets from World War I, and he was in the same squadron as Kiffin.
Wow.
And a lot of those wealthy elites, their boys were already in Paris, and I detail the story in my book, how they sort of came together bit by bit and piece by piece and formed an American group over there that was fighting for France.
A fellowship. So this book, in the process of writing of this book, did you find that you met some people that were very helpful to you?
Sure. There were real life people that were helpful to me, and I think that a lot of the people that I met were the people that I'm writing about. I really feel like I got to know them as I wrote the book. Yeah. Kiffin and Paul, just for starters, but a lot of the other boys as well. And I'm glad that I was able to tell their story, because I think it's a story a lot of Americans would find very interesting, and something that most Americans don't know about. as far as the live people that I met, there were so many people that I met through research in the various archives of different universities and libraries, and it was amazing to me. It was a whole new world of research and of doing research and finding details about people's lives that I never knew was out there. And a lot of the archivists they're all too ready to help.
Yes.
They're very friendly, very helpful, particularly at Washington and Lee, where, as I mentioned, Paul and Kiffin attended school. Paul actually survived World War I and survived for many years after that. He didn't die until 1985 at the age of 96. And he donated the papers that he had saved throughout all of World War I. He kept the papers for Kiffin and for a lot of these other boys. And the aerial squadron that they eventually formed was called the Escadrilla Americaine, the American squadron.
Yes.
And he became sort of an unofficial historian for that squadron and saved all the papers and the letters and diaries and things like that. He donated those to Washington and Lee.
I see.
And that's a tremendous resource for anybody that was doing research certainly on Kiffin, but even on World War I. It was just a tremendous resource. And the people there were very, very helpful.
Now, this is amazing. So the research, now, how do you do research? Is it now in the internet age that you don't have to go to Washington Lee anymore? Or did you still have to make some trips physically?
I made some trips physically, but I wonder how anybody wrote a book before the internet, because it made things so much easier. Just finding things, because you could do searches in different search engines or library archives and catalogs and find things that previously I wonder how you ever would have known about them.
Yeah.
And there were so many resources that I came across that I think other people had not tapped into. People, there have been other books written about certainly about the aerial squadron.
Okay.
The American squadron eventually was termed the Lafayette Escadrilla.
Oh, yes.
And there have been books and movies and things about that. But I found a lot of sources that others had not for whatever reason. And I think in my book, I have more of a chronological narrative that tells the whole story from beginning to end. And it really leaves off with the formation of the Lafayette Squadron.
Yeah.
I find that very interesting,
Yes.
but the more interesting part to me was the part leading up to it and the boys that came and volunteered when they didn't have to.
No.
Before America entered the war, before there was a draft, before you would have some sort of obligation. They had no obligation whatsoever, and other than their ideals. And that's what they relied on. They felt that a debt was owed, and they were willing to give their lives to repay it.
And to fight for another country.
To fight for another country. It's just a remarkable story. And most of these boys, I've read their letters, and I've read their diaries, and I've seen the photos and the accounts. And it's remarkable that they assumed that they were very likely to die. And yet it didn't deter them one bit. They would still write in their letters, that they would be glad to give their life in that sort of a manner to repay this debt. And it's almost foreign today.
Yeah. Yes.
And
yes.
I think my book really sheds additional light on this topic and on this time, and really opens a window into the ideals of this remarkable set of boys that unfortunately nobody knows anything about.
And this destiny of undying greatness, is this a family model, or did Keith and Rockwell grow up with this thinking?
Oh yeah, great question. Yeah, he definitely did. As you mentioned, both of his grandfathers fought in the Civil War, and I did a lot of genealogical research about his family, and actually I worked with some of his ancestors. His brother Paul, as I said, survived, and I worked with Paul's granddaughter. I can't remember if it's granddaughter or granddaughter, I'm sorry, but they gave me some of their materials and some of their photographs and some other interesting things. And in doing the research, I learned that both lines that led to Kiffin and his ancestry were chock full of mostly soldiers and preachers. And it's interesting that when you look back
The
genealogically,
combination.
it went soldier, preacher, soldier, preacher, soldier, preacher, back on both sides. And I spend the first 50 or so pages of the book detailing his ancestry up to his parents. And his parents were remarkable too. His father was a Baptist preacher and died just before Kiffin's first birthday, but I learned a remarkable bit about his father and his mother, who was the first osteopathic physician, female physician in North Carolina. She raised these two boys and a girl as a single mother, took care of them, saw to their religious education and to their schooling, and raised them to be these remarkable individuals. And I think a lot of that, as you hinted, came from their family background and their upbringing. Kiffin saw himself as a Rockwell, and that meant that you stood up for right, that you did these kind of things. And it was never a question for him of anything other than right or wrong. It was just a principle. And so he and Paul were actually the very first American volunteers to leave these shores and go to France to fight for France.
So now we talk a little bit about the social media part of the book. It's hard to have a book out without a website, without some form of communication with the public or direct marketing. Well, what do you do, and what have you found useful?
I don't know how useful I've found it so far, but I've tried to do that. And this is another, I wrote this book on my own. I did all the research on my own. My daughter did the cover and the formatting, and I've worked with her to get all this done and out there. But then I realized, hey, nobody's going to know about this. You need to market this. And I don't know much about marketing or websites. But I did do a website. It's undyinggreatness.com, and I put on that website some interesting things about the boys in the book, and there's some extras. Like I dug up some old video from World War I that has these boys in it, the boys that formed the squadron, and it's very clear and very good video. There's a bunch of old photographs, and I have a bunch of photographs in the book too, but I put some others on the website. And then I have like links to some of the music that they listened to, and they got an old phonograph when they were in the aerial squadron.
Yes.
One of Norman Prince's wealthy uncles gave them a phonograph, and I found some of the old songs that they used to listen to.
Wow.
Those are linked on the website, and there's some. I mentioned Alan Seeger, who was America's most famous poet. He wrote the poem "I Have a Rendezvous with Death." And it begins, I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade. And I think I found through my research, I really convinced myself anyway, that poem was a result of a night that he spent on guard duty with Kiffin Rockwell outside of a burned out chateau in Crayonnel, France, where they got overrun by Germans, and both of them nearly got killed. Alan Seeger even wrote to his father, "Believe me, I have had a close escape." And later he wrote that poem about his rendezvous with death. And on the website, I linked to a very well done performance of that poem, a recitation of that poem.
That would be a good way to connect with our public now, who's very much into interactive video and audio bits. And
yeah, it's very interesting, the stuff that I was able to find. And I've put some of it up. I've visited some of these sites. My wife and I went to France, and and we went to the grave of Kiffin Rockwell. I started an Instagram site too that I've just put up a few posts about different accounts from the book and some photographs and a little bit about what happened. And
Facebook also?
Facebook, I don't have a Facebook page for it. I just did the website and the Instagram. Maybe if I get some time, I'll do a Facebook. I didn't even have a Facebook page for myself until about a month ago. I finally did it.
That's the trouble. The more you do, the more you have to tend the garden, so to speak, right? So you have to limit it to a point that you can manage it.
Oh yeah, I mean I'm a full-time attorney. I've got five
kids.
I've got a million things going on, and
So let's talk about how you squeeze out that time to write a over 500-page book and over 100 pages of endnotes.
Yes. Well, like I said, I'm an attorney. I like to have a site for everything, and there are a lot of people interested in military aviation
Yes,
and in
the
these
research, yeah.
these boys. And so when I wrote the book, I thought I want to have a source for everything that I put in here because a lot of it is new information. And so in the end notes,
And how to find it, right? Because that's
right.
the
And so I
trick
cite
right
to
now.
the newspaper article, or I cite to the archive with the letter or the diary, and I've got it all in there. And so anybody that's interested can follow my trail. But you're right. I mean, it was a hard and long process. It took me 5 years. I mentioned that we published it on my son's 5th birthday, and that was sort of just a date that I pushed for and was able
Yes, you have
to meet.
Yeah, meet
But
that deadline.
I had 5 years of, I would come home from work, I'd sit on the couch, I'd read, I would type, I would read, I would send off, letters and checks. I mean, it costs a lot of money to get a lot of these resources from the various archives.
Right.
And I would get them in, and it felt like Christmas to me, when I would get their actual letters.
Yes.
And I could read through them and read what they wrote and what they felt at that time. And it was just incredible, the insight that I was able to gain into their motives and their passions and their beliefs. And I hope I transferred it into the book. I tried my best to do their story justice. But it was 5 years of, on my commute, I would take out my laptop. But it's amazing the things that you can get done if you turn off the TV.
Yes.
And focus, because in these little chunks of time and little bits, a couple hours every night, and I would work on the weekends, I was able to write a long, detailed, truthful account of America's entry into World War I. I suppose I could have watched American Idol or something,
Yeah. Or
but
right,
I didn't.
Right now,
I gave that up,
well,
thankfully.
Right now, boy, all the available Netflix and Hulu's and
Oh, I know.
TV shows. Yeah, so getting mail, huh? Getting mail again is a wonderful joy, right?
Oh boy,
Yeah.
I would just love it when things would come in, and it wasn't always in the mail.
Yeah.
A lot of it was transferred via email and Dropbox and these file downloads and things.
Yes.
Or a lot of it was where I would physically go to places and find things. And that is a very wonderful feeling when you can find something. And when I found, there's in earlier accounts of Kiffin and Paul, there's references to some of these letters and things, like their mother wrote letters to the ambassador in France, trying to get them out of the trenches and get them back home. She was worried sick. They were her only sons.
Yeah.
And I found one of those letters in French archives, and it was remarkable. Their mother had written this heartfelt letter, and people had always talked about it and known, but I actually found it.
Yes.
I found the letter that Kiffin and Paul wrote to the French consulate in New Orleans on August 3rd, 1914, the day after France and Germany went to war. They wrote a letter to the French consulate, and everybody had always said, because Paul said that Kiffin had written this letter, and in his book he put Kiffin's signature on it. I found the actual letter, and it turns out that Paul actually signed it. But when I got that letter, I just about cried. I thought, wow, this is so cool that I have the actual letter that they wrote. And it's a lot of instances like that over the 5 years just really made it worthwhile. It was the most fun I ever had.
Mark, when you went to France, was it your first time?
It was my first time, and we actually went for our 20th anniversary.
Oh.
And my good wife, who stuck with me through all this,
Right.
was
Did she
also,
wanted to go on this hunt for?
it was a hunt for. It turned into us traipsing across France,
Not the
visiting
usual,
these different sites.
Not the usual Parisian
Oh,
tour,
yeah.
right? Okay.
Well, we were in Paris because these boys were in Paris a lot, and there's actually some very neat memorials over there. There's a memorial in the Place des États-Unis, which is the place of the United States, right in the middle of Paris, and there's a very nice memorial there. And standing on top of it is a likeness of Alan Seeger. And it has all the names of the American volunteers etched into it, and Kiffin Rockwell is right there. and Alan Seeger, as I said, is on top of it. Kiffin's name is also on a memorial that they built outside of Paris. That's a memorial to the squadron that was formed by these boys, and his name's right there at the top of that. He was actually the first member of the squadron to shoot down a German airplane in combat. So we visited that. We visited his grave in Luxeuil, France, which is a beautiful little town over near Switzerland, and that's where the squadron was first stationed. It's actually where Kiffin is buried right now, and he's buried in the town cemetery with the flags of France and America over his grave, which I think is very fitting and appropriate.
So, Mark, where can we get your book?
You can pick it up at Amazon or Barnes & Noble or any of the major sellers.
And your website, too.
And my website, undyinggreatness.com.
You will be having other talks or marketing events for your book?
Yeah, I'm trying to get even more, but I will be speaking at the University Club downtown and at the library here in Glenview.
Mark, what do you enjoy about being part of Glenview?
Well, we moved here in 2009. We've really enjoyed it. It's sort of an all-American type city. There's a common sense of community here. We live not far from Glenbrook South, and two of my daughters already graduated from GBS. Another one is a junior there right now, and we've got two more on the way. My fourth daughter is a student at Glen Grove right now, and my son Kiffin just started kindergarten this year at Westbrook, where he's really enjoyed it. We do like Glenview. We have a good feeling here, and we've been here for 10 years and enjoyed every bit of it.
That's wonderful. Well, thanks for coming to our program.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity.
And thank you for watching. Join us next time on Off the Shelf.